Hey everybody, Mr. Grove here. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the kingdom fungi. And so fungus are some of the first unicellular eukaryotes, and they are eukaryotic. A few key components that will come off our list. They are very heterotrophic, so they don't make their own food, which means that they have to get food from somewhere. And so they're really good about just kind of breaking down organic material. They have really filamentous bodies, and so as you take a look at a mushroom, you'll see the little fibrous type filaments, and those are typically made of chitin. And so chitin is that kind of polysaccharide that we don't digest really well. We find it a lot of times in the covering of insects, the exoskeleton. And so, that's one of the reasons mushrooms are good diet foods. We don't really digest them just great, and they take up place in your stomach. So a good diet process. Another thing is they exhibit what's called nuclear mitosis. And so typically with mitosis, the nucleus will break down and dissolve as the chromosomes will kind of split apart. But in this case, the nucleus stays intact. Okay, and so that's kind of unique for the fungus. These filament bodies, so those slender filaments, are what we call hyphae. Okay, and so each one of these little fibers is a hyphae, but then underground, this giant tangled mass of hyphae is what we call the mycelium. And so the mycelium is really the living part of the fungus. And so when we see like a mushroom or a toadstool above the ground, that's just usually the reproductive structure. The rest of the fungus is actually all under the ground. And that's why avid mushroom hunters will, number one, they try and cut a mushroom off. They don't want to dig it out and potentially damage that mycelium. And then also, number two, is they don't like to tell their spots very well. And so that's because those mycelium are going to continue to grow year in, year out, and possibly produce more fruiting body mushrooms that you can collect the next year. Nutrient-wise, they're really, really good at just kind of secreting these digestive enzymes that can help decompose organic matter. And so they're really good at being recyclers. However, and sometimes they recycle stuff we're not ready for them to, like the food in your refrigerator. Sometimes they recycle living things, okay, so they'd be parasitic. So ringworm would be an example of that. If you've ever had athlete's foot or a yeast infection, those would be parasitic type funguses. Yeast, some are commercially valuable. So yeast for baking and brewing and fermentation. Some fungus play a big role in the process of cheese making. Antibiotics are created by a lot of different types of fungi, such as our penicillin molds. So there's a lot of positive aspects of fungus out there. So let's, reproductive-wise, the key is spores, and more spores. So they can sexually or asexually reproduce. They're good at both. But the key is to carry these really lightweight spores, and then the reproductive structure gets above the ground a little bit, so that way those spores can fly off and potentially form new mushrooms. So let's take a look at the three main phylum that we have. And so the first is Zygomycata. So the Zygomycetes are the molds, and so they're soft and squishy. They don't really have cell walls, which is why we get that soft, squishy feel to them. The stolons are going to be these little surface fibers of the mold, and then the rhizoids are kind of the root-like fibers that will kind of dig into the organic matter. And so the main Zygomycatas, these would be your common molds. And so they're just going to try and secrete those enzymes to break down the organic matter. In this case, that would be the orange. And they're really, really good at doing that. Reproductive-wise, so we have our hyphae that would fuse together. And so in fungus, we don't really have male-female per se. A lot of times they're called mating types, and so they just have like a plus and a minus mating type. So these opposite mating types will fuse together, form a zygosporangium. Now we're diploid. and then kind of immediately go back through meiosis to be haploid again. So the sporangium will form out of the zygosporangium, and that's what creates the spores. And so those spores will fly off, creating another haploid hyphae that could potentially fuse with an opposite mating type. Another phylum is the Asciomycetes. So the Asciomycata phylum, their spores will form in these little sac-like structures called asci. So that's kind of what this is here. And so these are typically our morels. You can kind of identify these guys. They're a little bit more wrinkly and pitted. Yeast would actually be an Asciomycete. Truffles would be an Asciomycete. And later we'll talk about lichens that will also be an Asciomycete. So that's the phylum Asciomycata. And our reproductive cycle is very similar. So our opposite mating types will fuse together. So once they fuse, we are now diploid. And almost immediately go back to haploid through meiosis, form the spores in the asci, and those haploid spores will fly out and form more mating types that are more hyphae that would be haploid. The last of the three major phylums is going to be the Basidiomycetes. So these are our club fungus. So they look like little clubs or mushrooms. And the spores are going to form in the basidia, and that's where the gills are underneath. They have cell walls like the Asciomycata did, and so that's why they're a little tougher, unlike the molds that are kind of that soft, fuzzy. So these are your classic mushrooms, toadstools, puffballs, shelf fungus. Chances are, if it's a member of the fungus family, it's probably a Basidiomycete. There just seem to be a little bit more common. Reproduction-wise, so our mating types again will fuse. They will form this diploid structure in the basidia. Those will go through meiosis, forming the spores also in the basidia. Those spores will fly off, and there's your haploid hyphae again that can potentially fuse with an opposite mating type. So that is kind of the overview of the fungus, and I hope that was helpful.